You also work on on another subject, which is the history of organization.
Oh, yes. Well, that's the important topic.
Could you talk about that?
Yes, that is a book that I actually started it just before 3 Mile Island. And I actually had a small grant from the National Science Foundation, which I hope there's no auditors around. I started using the money for normal accidents. And then I got another grant from them on that too. But I had a grant to study the fact that when you get a lot of large organizations interacting in the economy and in normal social terms, that you can have unexpected interactions that bring about big problems. It was the idea for normal accidents, but I was applying it to society as becoming more and more tightly coupled and having interactive complexity. But what I'm trying to do there is try to do an organizational model of society, because so much of society has been absorbed into large organizations. Things that used to be in communities, in families, in peer groups, in small standalone organizations, the local school, the travel agency, and so forth. A lot of things that these small groups and small organizations used to do are now being done within large organizations and controlled and organized by the large organizations. Healthcare is one obvious thing. You have to work for a large organization to get healthcare now, and it control in the U.S. We're not talking about the civilized countries in the world, like Europe, where healthcare is provided by the government. I'm talking only about a privatized system, and the U.S. is privatized capitalism. So organizations absorb a lot of these activities. It's a place where you can get religious advice, you can go to church there, you can get counseling, you can get marriage counseling, you can get sex counseling through the organization. They have their own travel office. They will recommend the particular Caribbean island that everybody from Exxon goes to, and you would love it down there, and you know your manager was there, and so you go to the hotel in the Caribbean, and my gosh, there's a lot of Exxon people here, so the organization is just transported to the recreational area, or they establish their own recreational areas. And you can go off for a cheap weekend at their resort, which they organize. The insurance companies in Hartford have Saks Fifth Avenue outlets in their buildings, so that you can during your coffee break or lunch you can do your shopping at some of the best stores in New York. They have outlets there. It's built right into the insurance company. You live your life inside the company. You meet your friends there. You meet your mate there. They provide for your funeral. There's not just a wreath from the company, but it's probably held in the company chapel. So more and more of life is absorbed into the large corporations. As I say, I was going to start about 1890 or 1920, and I kept going back, and so I finally ended up starting in 1800 in the U.S. And with the kind of legal revolution that made it possible to get the capital together, to have a big organization, to limit the liability so that only the organization, so to speak, can be sued, not the guy who owns it. He doesn't have to give up his house. It's only the organization that's liable, and how one organization can buy others and own other organizations. These were all developments that took place that were very important. And then I start with the textile mills, and it turns out there's just been excellent work done by historians on this, just kind of waiting to be put together in this fashion. The textile mills were roughly of two major types. One was mass production, and one was the current buzzword in industry, flexible production. Philadelphia had a flexible production textile economy, small firms, very nimble on their feet, high tech for the time, of course, rapidly changing technology and adapting to consumer changes, whereas Massachusetts, Lowell, Massachusetts, Waltham, Chicopee, and those big mills were models of mass production with very tight control over labor, high degree of wage dependency. As soon as the Irish came in, the farmers' daughters left, and the wages went down, the profits went up, and you had wage dependency of the most typical and worst kind that we began to witness from 1880 on. Whereas in Philadelphia, skilled labor, you left one place, you went to work for another place. You weren't blacklisted for leaving a place, and you could probably start your own business. It read like Philadelphia read like the accounts of northern Italy that appeared first in the Pure and Sable volume, and now have been studied so extensively. And I found this in 1840, 1850, these two models. Then I go into the railroads, which provided the major impetus for corporate capitalism on a large scale, and the multidivisional firm, as Chandler described it. And I find quite other reasons for it occurring than Alfred DuPont Chandler does. But his work is indispensable, monumental, and just magnificent. But I have a different interpretation of what he so well describes. So I cover the railroads, and again, there's another alternative path, to use the title of one terrific book about the railroads by Gerald Burke. Alternative tracks, he calls it. But there's an alternative path. At one crucial point, it was in dispute as to whether the railroad system should be a national one or a regional one. And there were strong arguments for a regional rather than a national system. The arguments being that it would develop regions, and so we would have manufacturing plants all over the country rather than centralized in Chicago or Detroit or something like that. You can do meat packing in St. Louis as well as Chicago, or in Madison, Wisconsin, or something. It's on a river. And what the railroads were doing was centralizing industry into these metropolitan areas. So all the meat packing took place here. The grain elevators were here. High degree of specialization. So regionalized railroad systems would spread industry, and we would have a bunch of small countries, so to speak, instead of one big national country. And they said, if you do that, then you won't have all the wealth piling up in one place. You won't have the centralization of wealth and the power that goes with the centralization of wealth in New York, Chicago, San Francisco. Instead, it will be a deconcentration of wealth and thus power. And that was an active battle which is totally ignored by Chandler, McGraw, other historians. When Gerald Burke dug this stuff up, he was the first one to ever discuss it and find it was there. And once he looked, the papers were full of it, the Senate debates were full of it. They did conceive of another way of running an organizational society. And the regionalists lost because you had people like J.P. Morgan who were very interested in centralizing everything. He wanted a few lines because he controlled many of them. He wanted a centralized steel industry. He wanted U.S. Steel, not a bunch of competing steel mills. He wanted Swift and Company to control the meatpacking industry and the distribution of it. Duke to control the cigarette industry, because not all of this J.P. Morgan himself, but the big financial centers wanted to deal with big centralized firms that sewed up the market for cigarettes and had controlled the market, and so could price the way they wanted and make the most money. So I'm looking at the development of a particular type of organizational society, a particular type of capitalism that was unique to this country. It didn't happen this way in the rest of the world. And that book is